Welcome to episode 4 of the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the content director at Word on Fire, and once again, we are joined by Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, so great to have you.
Always good to be on with you, Brandon.
Today we're talking about atheism. The show is titled Answering the Atheists, and in particular, we wanted to focus on this trend of the new atheism. Bishop Barron, you've written several articles and videos over the years in response to many of its main proponents, including people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, etc. This is kind of not a new content of atheism, but a new style, a new mode of communicating it. What do you see as something that marks it different from older forms of atheism?
Yeah, and I think the point you made there is a very important one, that I don't think, as I read these gentlemen, there's anything particularly new in terms of the arguments. Most of it is a rehashing of people like Ludwig Feuerbach, Sigmund Freud, Jean-Paul Sartre, the sort of classical atheists. So it's a rehearsing of those arguments. I'd say a couple things about the novelty. I think it was a post-September 11th phenomenon. A lot of these books came out just as the last decade was getting underway. And I think it was a revival there of the old Enlightenment argument. So in the wake of September 11th, what did people see? They saw fanatical religion. And the old Enlightenment argument was that because religion is irrational, the only way it can defend itself is through violence. So I think that's what prompted these new atheists. Secondly, I'd say it's new in its vitriol and in the kind of meanness of the approach. Go back to someone like Sartre or even Freud or Feuerbach. They're certainly enemies of religion, but they took religion seriously and they engaged it in a much more kind of highbrow fashion. What I see in the new atheists is a sort of disdain for religion. You know, like the old atheists, they think it's wrong, but they also have this kind of condescending disdain for it, that only an idiot could possibly subscribe to these views. So I've always found that really off-putting about what's new in the new atheism. But it's not content. It's not as though, we found some really, really convincing new arguments. These arguments are as old as the hills.
Yeah, and I think for that reason, the new atheism is worth answering, again, not because it's substantial, but because it's more and more prevalent. It's sweeping across the culture, especially on the internet. Atheists are disproportionately represented online. So for all of those reasons, we thought we'd tackle some of the most common arguments that you hear from the new atheists. So let's start with this first one. And I think this is the most popular one. You know, I run a website, strangenotions.com, which atheists and Catholics dialogue, and this is the most common one we hear. It's, what evidence is there for God? It reminds me of the great atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell. He was asked what he would say if he found himself standing before God on Judgment Day, and God asked him, "Why don't you believe in me?" And Russell said he would reply, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." So what do you say to someone who says there's just no evidence?
Yeah, good. And actually, I'm kind of pleased to hear that's maybe the number one thing that you hear on your website, because in some ways it's very easy to refute that. The trouble is the loaded term evidence. Evidence is a term that's drawn largely from the sciences. So you're looking for physical evidence for whatever phenomenon you're discussing. Or you form a hypothesis, and then you say, well, let's look for evidence that would back up this hypothesis. That's fine within the scientific framework. That's part of the scientific method, looking for empirically verifiable or physical traces in the world. Well, if that's what you mean by evidence, I agree with them. There's no evidence for God. But here's the trick. God is not subject to the norms of the scientific method, because God is not a being in the world. God is rather, as Thomas said, ipsum esse, the sheer act of to be itself, in and through which all things that the sciences look at come to be. So the one thing you're not going to find is God using the scientific method, because he is prior to and more ontologically basic than anything the sciences can investigate. Here's what I would suggest, and I have done this to new atheists who use that evidence, appeal to evidence. I'll say, no, there's no evidence for God if you mean it in your typical scientific way. But there are plenty of rational warrants for belief in God. I'd put it that way. Because then you're not limiting it to what the sciences can discover, but then you're open to Thomas Aquinas, who argues from the contingency of the world to the non-contingent ground. You're open to all sorts of rational approaches, but which aren't scientific. So I would urge people that appeal to this argument to broaden their epistemological horizons. I mean, there's more than science. There's more than the scientific method. You can be utterly rational and not be scientific, So the trouble with the whole evidence appeal or science is the only way to know reality, well, you're saying that so Homer and Plato and Shakespeare and Dante have no truth claims to make. Well, that's nonsense. They're saying all kinds of true things about the world, but not in a scientific way. So change the term from evidence to rational warrant, and then we'll take it from there.
You talk a lot in the Mystery of God study program, which we'll get back to a little later in the show, about some of these reasons or rational warrants for believing in God. So if you want to have a deeper look at some of those, check out Bishop Barron's Mystery of God study program. The second common argument you'll often hear from atheists is based on maybe a cursory exposure to Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle's arguments for a first cause. And many atheists, after reading that, will conclude, well, if everything has a cause, then what caused God? How could God be the first cause? Because then you'd still need to say, well, what caused him? So how would you reply to that?
Well, it's a sophomoric sort of argument because the principle is not everything has a cause. The principle is contingent things have a cause. Things that don't explain their own being have a cause. And the whole point of the demonstration is that we finally must come to one reality, namely God, namely ipsum esse, that isn't caused. So the trouble there is that you just get off on the wrong foot. If you think the principle is everything has a cause. No, contingent things have a cause. So now the argument unfolds. If a contingent thing, like you and me or this room, has a cause, well, then what caused it? Okay, is that contingent or not? If it is, we got to keep looking. Back and back you go, but the one thing you can't do is appeal to an infinite causal series, because then you haven't found a ground for contingency at all. You must come, the argument concludes, to some reality which is not contingent. So I think we have to dismiss that kind of sophomoric observation. But I'll say a lot of really smart people have made just that observation. But as I say, it's not really grasping the nettle of the argument. We're in fact proving that there is at least one reality that doesn't have a cause. So to say like what caused God is a bit like saying why isn't a triangle a square? It's the one thing God can't be is caused.
One of the other popular objections you'll hear, and I think this has increased as our culture has leaned more toward a scientistic point of view, and I don't mean just hailing science for all the great good it's done. I mean exclusively seeing science as the only way to know things in the world, is the objection that, well, science has disproved God or religion, or that they're somehow incompatible. How would you reply to that?
Well, let me first talk about what your opening observation. See, scientism, the trouble with it, namely the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge, is self-contradictory. Because you say to someone, where did you see that principle? How did you experiment so as to derive the truth of that principle? Someone that says all true things are known through the sciences, that's not a scientific claim. That's a metaphysical kind of claim. And we can debate it and dispute it, but scientism in itself is self-refuting. It's self-contradictory. See, people, they're in a certain way beguiled by science. Think of the movie The Martian, which I liked very much, but it's undergirded by this kind of assumption that science will explain everything and believe in science. But you see, there's the problem right there. If you say, I believe in science, well, then that's a non-scientific claim. So people that are non-scientistic, like you and me, we got our foot in the door the minute you say that. Oh, I believe that science is the all-explaining thing. Well, clearly it's not, because you didn't scientifically derive that principle.
Well, you've mentioned before, too, that science depends on certain philosophical presuppositions that can't be explained by science. So things like the intelligibility of the world or the principle of causality. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, think of that's a good example of what I was just describing. What has to undergird any scientist of any stripe, psychologist, physicist, botanist, chemist, is they assume the intelligibility of what they're going to be examining. The more you think about it, the stranger that seems, though. Why would you just naturally assume that the being that we encounter will be rationally understandable? But every scientist has to assume that. But there's no experiment that shows you that truth. Rather, all experiments are based on that assumption. That comes, I would argue, from theology. It comes from a keen sense, or you say philosophy at a high level, a keen sense of the Creator God. If there is one ultimate cause of all things, and that ultimate cause is intelligent, then you will expect intelligibility in all things. Again, the more you think about that, the stranger it becomes. We take it so for granted, but it's a fundamentally theological assumption that undergirds the sciences. Oh, the other thing, I remember you talked about, does science disprove God, right? Again, that's almost self-contradictory as well. As I said, God is not a being in the world. The sciences in all their different dimensions deal with things in the world that can be empirically verified or experimented upon, right? There's the method. But what they can't in principle comment upon, draw conclusions about, is that transcendent reality in and through which all worldly things come to be. That's why when a scientist, he said, oh, I've proven God through science. That's as nonsensical as saying I've disproven him through science. Science is not a tool that can be used in the adjudication of this question. That's why other rational methods, like philosophy, have to be invoked. That's something my mentor, Cardinal George, often said, was we rush too quickly to religion and science. See? What we need is the mediating discipline of philosophy. It shows you that you can speak in a rational way about realities that transcend the sciences. And once you get that, oh, okay, now I can see how religion, too, can be rational. So I think that mediating discipline of philosophy is key to recover here. But see, don't allow the scientistic mind to dominate. It's a house of cards. It'll collapse in upon itself. I think we should boldly claim the rational tools that we have to show that belief in God is reasonable, and stand up and resist the scientistic advocates.
Tell me if this jives with your experience, but a lot of times if I talk to an atheist or a skeptic of some sort who claims that science has disproven God or rendered him useless or unnecessary, almost inevitably they view God as a scientific explanation, and even more often as sort of a being within the world. And it really gets to this deeper issue of, is God just a being, one hypothesis among many, or is he the ground of all that exists? Because they'll say, like, at one time we didn't know how thunder and lightning work. We thought it was God slamming down his hammer like Thor, and now we do. So we don't need God to explain that. Or we didn't know how the sun and the moon and the planets all move through the cosmos, but now we do. So we don't need God to explain that. But that view of God, wouldn't you say, is a deeply misunderstood view of what we mean by God?
I would say that Thomas Aquinas anticipated Occam by a century and formulated a version of Occam's razor, which is the view that all things being equal, the simpler explanation should be preferred, right? So when Thomas is articulating an objection to God's existence, he uses that. He says, well, can't all things be explained through an appeal to natural causality? And so if that's true, why do we need God? So that objection is as old as Thomas Aquinas, certainly. See, what's the answer? The answer is when you're looking for God, you're right. You're not looking for one contingent cause among many. You're not looking for, okay, for the moment, I don't really understand this, but eventually I will. Oh, that's what causes thunder, When you're looking for God, you're looking for the ultimate cause of the very to-be of the universe. You're not looking for one more, however big it is, one more contingent cause. What you're looking for is the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that is not a scientific question. That's a philosophical question or theological one. So again, it's a being lured into the trap of scientism, I think, when people say, well, natural causes explain everything. They can't explain why there's something rather than nothing, why the very to-be of the universe is. So I think it's the collapse of other rational forms into one rational form, namely the scientific.
You mentioned St. Thomas's assumption that one of the arguments that can be posed against God is the argument from parsimony, that we don't need God to explain some of these things, therefore God doesn't exist. The other argument that he thought was a strong one, but ultimately answerable against God, was the age-old problem of evil. So I want to spend a little more time on that one, because I think for many atheists on the ground, this is really the most personal, heartfelt reason why they could never believe or follow God. So what is the problem of evil, and how would you at least begin to flesh out an answer?
Yeah, good. And I think you're right. It is, I think, the most compelling argument against God. Although, as I'll try to clarify, it's more emotionally compelling than intellectually compelling. Thomas Aquinas put it this way, again, in these beautifully understated arguments he made against God. He said, if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. So he said, if there were infinite heat, there'd be no cold, right? So God is described as the infinitely good. So if he exists, how could there possibly be evil? Now, that's a pithy and very tight formulation of the argument from evil. How do you respond? Well, I'll give you Thomas's response. And he was drawing on something much earlier than himself, namely the reflections of Augustine, where Augustine said, God is so powerful that he can permit evil so as to bring about a greater good. So a first clarification is that evil is not something. You know, Augustine saw this. Evil is a privation of the good. Think of a cavity in your tooth that's bugging you. It's a lack of a good that ought to be there. Think of a cancer that's compromising your system. It's a lack of what ought to be there. Think of blindness. It's a lack of vision that ought to be there. So it's not like dark side of the force, light side of the force. Like you've got two powerful things fighting each other. Evil's not a thing. It's an absence. So first of all, there's no power, and certainly not God, who produces or creates evil. You can't create it or produce it. It's permitted by God. Permitted. Now why? Go back to Augustine. So as to bring out of that a greater good. You know, and we can give loads of examples of this. Certain goods that would not exist were there not certain evils. Thomas's own example, which I've always loved, is there's no life in the lion without the destruction of the antelope. You know, so the lion in all of its glory and beauty wouldn't exist unless the antelope were devoured by the lion. God permitting evil so as to bring about a good that wouldn't otherwise be there. His other example is there's no virtue of the martyr without the tyranny of his tormentor. You know, so think of it, even though it might seem weird, but no Hitler, no Edith Stein. No Hitler, no Maximilian Kolbe. No Hitler, broaden it out. Think of all of the innumerable acts of nobility and courage and kindness and so on that happened during World War II precisely because of the suffering. So that's the principle. That's the principle. Now, I totally get, I can feel people hearing me reacting. I totally get the emotional reaction to it. I don't mean that in a condescending way at all. I mean, I experience it. When something goes bad in my life and, God, how could you do this? How could you allow this to happen?
Like when your microphone falls down and you say, God, how could you do this to me?
Why are you doing this to me? Right. So I get the emotional power of it. But go back now, having articulated this principle, go back to the intellectual side. God, by definition, has an infinite mind. And God is presiding over all of space and all of time. Think about that. All of space, all of time. What do we see of space and time but this tiny, tiny, tiny fragment? Can you see how it's a little off kilter for us, therefore, to say, this makes no sense. There's no redeeming value to this. Well, I mean, how in the world would you know? Because by definition, a finite mind cannot take in the workings of an infinite mind. See, that's why I say from a purely intellectual standpoint, the objection kind of fades away. It's like a little child, 3-year-old child, who couldn't possibly understand what his parents are about and who is facing some suffering they have imposed upon him and wondering, like, how in the world could they be doing this? Well, think of that difference and now multiply it to the nth degree. the difference between our finite minds and God's infinite mind, which is worrying about all of space and all of time. Of course things seem anomalous to us. Of course they do. But it would be arrogant in the extreme for us to say, because I don't get it, there's no meaning. That's like a beginning math student in 6th grade looking at Einstein's most elaborate formulas and saying, well, this is just a bunch of nonsense. They're just silly symbols on the page, Well, a fortiori, raised to the nth degree, that's us in relation to God. So those are some points I would use in responding to this extremely powerful objection, at least from the experiential standpoint.
You recently came out with a whole new study program called The Mystery of God, Who God Is and Why He Matters. It contains a whole collection of resources, but the main component is this 6-part video course where you look at many of the questions we've discussed here in much more depth. So can you tell us a little bit about why you created that program, why now, and tell us a little bit about what's in it?
Yeah, I think I did it, Brandon, because I was getting so annoyed at the new atheists and especially at the impact they were having on young people. I mean, so many people have come to me and say, I've been to college now, or even in high school, and these really compelling arguments against God. Then you see the new atheists who are very skillful evangelists. I think you've described them that way. They're very skillful evangelists at propagating their message. And they're using all the new media, et cetera, et cetera. So I just feel the church has got to be in that arena, and it's got to be there as an opposing voice. So that's why I did it. I wanted to present something that was not like, reading a 500-page philosophical study, but was substantive enough to give everybody, maybe especially high school kids, college kids, some way of answering these objections. What's in it is really a encapsulation of my Doctrine of God class that I taught for 20 years at Mundelein Seminary. So I had a 10-week thoroughgoing course in God. And I thought, well, let's try to bring that down to a more digestible level without flattening it out, without dumbing it down. So that was the instigation for it, and that's more or less the content. So we talk about all the issues you raised, among others. And I hope young people can use it.
You can learn more about that at mysteryofgod.com, and especially if you have a young adult child, maybe who's going off to college, this would be a great gift to give them to solidify their understanding of God and how to answer many of these atheist objections. In addition to the video course, there's a study guide written by Trent Horn, who is an apologist at Catholic Answers. There's a pocket guide to answering atheists, which contains a condensed version of several of these points. So find that at mysteryofgod.com. In the next segment here, we're going to bring in our first caller. A few shows back, I told you that we're welcoming calls from you. If you'd like to ask a question of Bishop Barron, you can go to askbishopbarron.com, and you can record a question either on your phone or your computer and send it in. And each episode, we'll pick one question that Bishop Barron can answer. Today, the question comes from David, a young father who asked a question that's really pertinent to the topic we're discussing here. So I'm going to play that question now.
My name is David from Michigan, and my wife and I are expecting our first child in a few months. In your work, you often discuss the nature of God theologically, making sure to point out that we as Catholics don't think of him as just a super powerful being among many, but something greater and more fundamental than that. How would you recommend teaching children about God in a way that they can understand while not making him out to be just another being among many?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm very grateful for it. Stay with an analogy. I'll say something now positive about the sciences. I'm always positive about the sciences. It's scientism I don't like. Let's say you got a little tiny kid. So your wife's about to give birth. So little tiny kid, and he wonders, Daddy, where's the sun go at night? And you could say things like, well, you're going to sleep and the sun's going to sleep. Fine. That's probably what the young mind can take in. Now, he grows up, moves through life, starts going to school, and you might use maybe slightly more sophisticated analogies. Now the sun gets bigger and bigger, goes more and more to school, and now you get him into the sciences, and then maybe you do Stephen Hawking at the end of the day. My point is, it's okay to follow this sort of natural pedagogy. Think of Thomas Aquinas and this discussion of God as ipsum esse, not one being among many, that he's not contained in a genus, he's actus purus. Think of all of that as it's graduate school. That's rational reflection on God at its highest pitch. Well, not everyone's ready for that. Thomas one time received a letter from an older woman who said, Friar Thomas, is it true to say that the names of the blessed are written on a scroll in heaven? Well, Thomas, intuiting undoubtedly that he wasn't dealing with a very sophisticated or educated person, wrote back and said, well, there's no real evidence for that, but there's also no harm in thinking it so. Which I thought was a wonderful answer. He was acknowledging, well, no, look, there's really no ground for that kind of literalism, but it won't do you any harm to think so. And I think that should guide our thinking about how we educate our kids. Now, here's the thing. What happens to a lot of people is they get stuck at, the sun's going Betty by. They get stuck with a very childish approach to religion. What I would encourage you to do is keep pressing, so that the child, as he develops and matures intellectually, won't get stuck at this primitive level. I'll go back to the New Atheists. Read the New Atheists, and you'll find they're going after very primitive, childlike, childish views of God. So I would say don't let your son or daughter get stuck, but press them on religion as you'd press them in the sciences. You'd be pretty unhappy, I bet, if when your child's 20, he still thinks the sun goes Betty by. But we're somehow okay with a lot of our 20-year-olds staying at that level in regard to their faith. So anyway, that's my fervorino. But I'd say it's okay. You don't have to begin with God as ipsum esse. You can begin, as the Bible often does. Look at parts of the Bible where God is very much personified in a sort of literalistic way. Fine. But then the Bible moves on, and it addresses other audiences. It's as though Israel is being lured as it matures intellectually. Anyway, that's kind of a rambling answer to your good question.
Let's close here with a request that we've gotten from several people who have written into the show. After listening to the first couple episodes and hearing some of your book recommendations, they said, we want more of those. We want book recommendations on each episode. So this one on atheism, we've talked about a couple resources already. Definitely your Mystery of God series, mysteryofgod.com. Mm-hmm. Trent Horn, who wrote the study guide for that, also has his own good book called Answering Atheism. But what would you recommend for some other resources to either understand atheism better or to be able to respond to it?
Well, at a higher level, if you want to go high octane, get David Bentley Hart's book. His book is very fine, and it revolves around the point we've been making a lot today, that it's a misunderstanding of God that gives rise to a lot of these objections. A little further back in the 20th century, get Henri de Lubac's The Drama of Atheist Humanism. I think is very helpful at understanding how this fits into the more contemporary conversation. Then, I go back to the classics, go back to Aquinas, and read the first 13 questions of the Summa Theologiae if you want graduate school high-octane reflection.
And Bishop Barron is probably too coy to recommend it himself, but his own book on Aquinas covers Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God and gives a more digestible approach to them than just reading Aquinas straight through. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode 4 of the Word on Fire show. Be sure to download the podcast at wordonfireshow.com. Also, be sure to subscribe on iTunes. And please submit your questions at askbishopbarron.com because we'd love to hear from you and answer your questions right here on the show. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Word on Fire show.